So what I did was actually on the way over here, I was looking at your installation, drasha,
Oh,
well,
right.
or sermon, speech, I guess.
Yeah,
So I was really impressed. I have to say, I was really impressed. It was amazing. You checked a lot of the boxes on there. Um, I think the one thing that stood out to me was how it was clearly a speech, but you had incorporated it, people in it, and in the sense that you called on people in the audience, and they recognized who they were and their place in your speech, and it felt much less like a speech and a monologue than like a dialogue. And I imagine that's probably quite intentional on your part. And I wanted maybe if you could throw yourself back 8 years ago, and talk to me a little bit about how you went about preparing that speech for that day.
that's a great question. I don't really remember or how I prepared for it. It's a
It's
long
probably
time
a bit of a
ago.
blur, I would imagine.
The truth of the matter is, though, it's an interesting point. My speaking style tends to differ a little bit between drashas and the more formal occasion, or what I perceive as a more formal occasion like that. So, just an interesting note in general, I actually never write out my drashas. I don't type them and I don't write them word for word. It's unfortunate for me because I don't have a record of what I actually said, and it's unfortunate for people because they always ask me if they really liked it. They'll say, "Oh, can you give me a copy?" And I can't. Or if they weren't there, they'll say, "Oh, someone told me you spoke about this. Can you send?" And I can't, which is unfortunate. But it was advice that I got very early on when I was a rabbinic intern in Great Neck. Rabbi Polkoff heard me speak, and I had written out my remarks. And I was trying not to read from the sheet, but to sort of glance at it. And I practiced a lot. So I was making eye contact with the audience. That wasn't really the issue. But he said that I have a great style of connecting with people, and when I'm doing it from such a formalized text, that it doesn't come across. So that I shouldn't be so worried about saying the right thing. I'm going to say the right thing, and I should just, sort of take some notes and work from there. So ever since then, I stopped writing out my drashas. At the beginning, I still did it Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. I wrote them out in full. And then I stopped that as well because I really didn't feel I was connecting to the text or to the audience as well. But when I'm doing a speech, let's say at the annual gala dinner or at the installation, or at the beginning of the war, we had a Tehillim gathering like very early on, and I went to be very careful about what I said. So in those occasions, I actually do type out what I'm going to say, and that was one of those occasions. So that's just one big difference between that speech and some of my others.
Yeah.
Uh,
I would imagine it was probably very freeing for you. I mean, maybe exhilarating at the same time, to not have to be tied to notes.
yes and no. I actually I work much harder in advance without the text than I did when I had a prepared text. When I had a prepared text, I practiced it, but I relied much more on being able to go back and forth between the text. What I do now is I prepare notes handwritten, and sometimes I write out full sentences, but most of the time it's bullet point. And I spend hours going over in my head how I'm going to say it, what I'm going to say, and not saying the whole thing out, but reviewing it. So it takes much more time. So it's freeing in the sense that I can get into it. I can invest my whole persona into it in the moment, and I can feel free to really absorb what's going on in the room and connect to the room instead of the paper. But it actually is much more work, as I'm
Yeah.
sure you can imagine.
Yeah. It is work, and my background as a comedian, we don't go up there with notes. Maybe the first time you try to joke, but the whole business is memorizing what you're going to say,
Right. I can
and
imagine
being
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, being present. So you're right. It is more work, but on the other hand, you are more present, and more spontaneity can ensue.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. I I try to prepare everything I'm going to say, even though it's not written out, so that it's not totally spontaneous. Like for a shear, certainly it's spontaneous. I don't have notes in that way or written text. But for the drashas, I pretty much know ahead of the drasha exactly what I'm going to say. I won't say it's totally memorized, but close to it.
Yeah, that I would imagine that it's a little bit more fluid exactly what you're going to say, You have the content, you have the order in your mind, and then you kind of fill in the blanks. You trust yourself to fill in the blanks. Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah. So I wanted to ask you a couple things. There were a couple things that popped out from a little bit of research. One of them was, I guess, when you first became the rabbi there. So there was a note that an email that went out, and it said this was from a past president, Saul Newman. I don't know him, but I'm sure the name means something to you.
Yeah.
But it said we knew from the moment we met Rabbi Weinberg that he was truly special. He has touched the personal, spiritual, intellectual, and religious hearts and minds of all the members. Um,
Wow. It's
Pretty
impressive.
flattering, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So tell me a little bit about how you try to touch all of those sectors, where because it's always a balance between intellectual versus spiritual or more inspirational. So how do you toe that line?
I do try to hit a lot of those points, specifically in the drashas, but also in general in the Rabbanis outside of the drasha. I think from the intellectual standpoint, I try to um, number one, build in important content into the drashas and not just sort of speak about loose ideas, but really ground it in the text. Whether the text is a pasuk that I'm then analyzing or questioning, or it's a medrash that I'm analyzing or questioning, or it's the contrast of two sources, I try to build it out in that way so it's intellectually stimulating. And I try to quote sources if I can and read some of them. I think reading too much tends to distract people. So I try to choose carefully what I'm going to read and what I'm going to paraphrase. Um, but at the same and in addition to that, I really like the style of building the tension of a question into the drasha. I think it not only keeps people's interest, but also makes it more intellectually stimulating. So as opposed to sort of just jumping in with the idea, I really try to build up the question in the beginning, whether that's a life question, a circumstance question that then is answered by the text, or a textual question that then is answered by sources leading to another life point. However I do it, I try to build up the tension in the question and I try to include sources. That's really from the intellectual standpoint. But the idea of the drasha and the message of the drasha is really more to touch people's heart. So much so that there are occasions when I speak many drashas where the text and the intellectual part is just the avenue and the inroad to get to the emotional point that I want to make or to touch people in an emotional way. And that doesn't make it less important, but it's not necessarily the starting point of the drasha. So,
Mhm.
and touching people intellectually is important because I think they take it more seriously. But touching people as a person, whether you call them intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, whatever you call that, it means touching people where they're at. I think is really what people are looking for and what draws them to the drasha. You could hear a very intellectual person speak and give a very well crafted drasha, but if it doesn't touch people, then they're probably not going to be affected by it.
Yeah. Tell me about some of your background, where you learned your craft.
I think I learned from a variety of sources, which I'll mention in a second. But really, in the end of the day, I think it was developing my own style and rhythm that I just felt right to me and reflected me. So at different points earlier in my Rabbanas, or even before my Rabbanas, I tried to emulate different other speakers, and I think it came off well, but it didn't feel like me. Or I've tried to take drashas that a friend has given or someone else has given that I thought were great, and when I take a look at it, because I'm in a rush and I on a Friday I need a drasha, I call a friend. Do you have a drasha for Parshas Yisro? And they'll send it to me. I can't give it. It just doesn't feel like my style. So I think I just do what I feel is true to myself. That's really the style that I developed. But I did learn from a lot of people who had a big influence on me. Certainly Rabbi Lookstein, who was our homiletics teacher in YU. I learned a lot from that class. I learned a lot from him as a person, just about Rabbanus and about being a rabbi and being a mensch, but also, in terms of drasha giving, to have a structure to it, to make sure that, you include the intellectual component as well. So I learned a little bit from him. I was 2 years the intern at Great Neck Synagogue with Rabbi Polikoff in Great Neck, and so listening to many of his drashas, I learned from his style and his approach, which was really to always end with a takeaway and some charge to the people, which I try to incorporate that piece. Rabbi J.J. Shachter has been a huge influence on me just in terms of developing material, how to look at a source, how to question a source, how to develop that tension question within the drasha. So I continue to learn a tremendous amount from him. Rabbi
I
Zeitz,
saw that you edited one of his books of his. Yeah.
yeah, recently he asked us to produce a book to incorporate a lot of the different participants in his yearly Yarchei Kala and have them, write drashas. And so we did edit that. It wasn't his work; it was, in honor of him. But yeah, actually, another influence on me was my rabbi growing up, Rabbi Mordechai Zeitz, who was the rabbi of my shul for many, many years in Montreal. So I know just by osmosis, I absorbed a lot from him, and he was my first and primary influence. So he encouraged me to start speaking even in high school. I gave one or two drashas on youth Shabbases and stuff like that. And then later, once I was in YU, he often asked me to speak when I was home on vacation, different times. And I had never even been exposed to Rabbi Lookstein or Rabbi Paul, any of those people. So really, I think the primary influence at that point was him. And that made a big impact on me.
Yeah. At what point? So you spent 6 years in West Hartford,
I did, yes.
and now you've been here 8 years.
This is our
So
ninth year. Yeah, we're in our
yeah.
ninth
So
year.
you're rounding year in 15 at this point. At what point do you feel like you hit your stride?
I'm still working to get there. Really, people ask me this all the time. I meet with every bar and bat mitzvah boy and girl before their bar mitzvah and bar mitzvah, and often if they're speaking, they're very nervous. And I tell them, I hope this doesn't make you feel worse, but I have been speaking for 15 years and I'm still nervous every time I speak, and it doesn't get easier for me. And it's the truth. So if stride means it comes easily, it hasn't. If stride means, I sort of fell into my style, I think that probably early on in West Hartford already, I had developed sort of the system of how I like to work on things and how I like it to come out. Um, to some degree, that's actually an impediment. I think I've sometimes fall into the rut of using the same style too often, and I have to be conscious of changing that up more. But I think early on, I fell into that.
Uh-huh. Yeah, you looked very aligned, congru congruent,
Yeah.
at the installation already, and that was, 8, 9 years ago. And so, how how long do you speak for typically?
10 to 12 minutes. I like short speeches. On occasion, they'll go longer, 15 minutes. On Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, I speak longer than that. I try to really develop something more. So it's probably more 20, sometimes 25 minutes. Not by design, but just because I think people want to hear something of more substance and they're willing to sit a little bit longer through it, especially on Yom Kippur where there's not much else to do. But on a regular Shabbos, between 10 and 15 minutes.
Mhm. So you
I
mentioned
found that's
earlier.
like a sweet spot. It just sort of, it wasn't even by design, although people do say, oh, speak for 10 to 12 minutes. But I find in order to just get the question developed, get an answer, and give a takeaway, that's how long it takes. And I feel that within that time span, I really have people's interest. So I've found that as the sweet spot.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess you can kind of feel the room. There's
Very much.
certain. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, so you mentioned earlier that sometimes you give a peer, a colleague, call on a Friday. What's your process? Because it's Friday. Well, you said this week it's a scholar in residence. So, but what's a typical week for you? When does the drasha get prepared?
It's usually a work in progress. On Wednesday, I'm already starting to think, about topics and different ideas about what's going on in the world, what's going on in shul, what's going on in our lives, and that kind of thing, and already start to look through, Sfarim and through my files to see what ideas spark me. By Thursday, I'm already sort of working in earnest on preparing two or three or four ideas and seeing where they lead me. by Thursday night, and certainly Friday morning, I've sort of locked in on which of those I want to go in on. And then Friday, I'm working on how to put it together, how to craft it, which words to use, those kind of things. And then even till Shabbos morning, I get up very early Shabbos morning and I come to my office where it's quiet and I think through very much in greater detail than my notes to what words I want to use and how I want to say it.
Yeah, there's nothing like that approaching deadline that just makes it much more real,
Yeah.
than it did on the paper a couple days earlier.
Yeah, that's the truth. You're very right about that. I found, I can't remember when, but at some point I tried to like practice maybe on Fridays. It didn't go. I couldn't feel it, and I have to wait till right before Shabbos morning, which really shows you it's less about the idea and the text. It's really about how you're feeling and how you're connecting to the material and how you're going to connect to the audience. So um, that I have realized as well.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you a question I ask a lot of people, and I get a variety of answers. But have you ever shown up on a Shabbos morning and the speech the drasha that you prepared, it's just not the right drasha for the day, whatever it is. You're not feeling it. They're not feeling it. It's just not there. What do you do under those circumstances?
In my recollection, it happened twice. There may have been more times, but twice that I can remember where I came Shabbos morning. I said, I really don't like this. I just really don't like it. It's not what I want to be saying this Shabbos. And I latched on to another idea and I made it work. I can't say it was as developed or as long as my regular drasha would be. It was probably more of a Dvar Torah couched in the style of a drasha. So, but yeah, it worked. It makes me very nervous to do that, but it worked in those circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so I want to ask you,
There
right,
are
because
times when I'll modify, like when I will have my drasha prepared, and there's a part of it that I don't like, or I want to switch the order. That happens often, on Shabbos morning as I'm saying it out to myself in my head. It's like I think this would be better if I said it differently, or if the message was slightly different. That often happens, but to start from scratch and throw out the whole idea, I think it's happened only a handful of times.
yeah. How does it affect your davening afterwards, after you come down? Are you able to concentrate during Musaf? Do you?
So interestingly, in KMS, all the drushes are after davening.
Oh,
So I never speak before Musaf. Um, so I actually have to hold on to the drasha through both Shachris and Musaf. I think if I had to daven after, I would be very distracted. I would be thinking, what did I say? Did I actually say that? How did it go? What am I? It's actually quite a relief to not have to daven after that, and I go straight into Kiddush. So either people are talking to me about it and engaging me about it, or I forget about it because we're on to new things. So I don't have
yeah,
to think, but it does detract a little bit from my davening because I'm thinking about it, what to
right,
say and how to say it.
right. What is your preparation process like for the marathon? Beginning Motzei Tisha B'av through Yom and Orayim, and I don't know if you speak on Sukkot or not, but
Yeah. So actually, it starts before for me because I speak a lot on Tisha B'Av. I've made a sort of very big deal about Tisha B'Av, as many rabbis have. Um, and so I prepare a tremendous amount for Tisha B'Av. And I prepare not just, drashas before and a preparatory shir and, sometimes an afternoon shir, but also the explanatory keynote with, multimedia presentations and stories and texts. And so I actually start then. Um, Usually by Shiva Sabra Tammuz, I'm into that. And then as soon as I can't think about anything else till Tisha B'Av is over. So that's till Tisha B'Av is over. After Tisha B'Av, I usually take some vacation or break and then start in earnest when I get back on preparing for the Yamim Noraim. What I try to do is to think about themes before I think about specific drashas so that I don't overlap, so that I have a Shabbos Hagadol idea, Shabbos Shuva, sorry, Shabbos Shuva idea, um, in a Rosh Hashanah idea, a Yom Kippur idea, and then make sure that they're all sort of fitting together and not repetitive. And then once I know the ideas, the pre-Rosh Hashanah shir, I just make sure the themes are all, not repetitive. And once I have the ideas, I actually really start to work mostly on the Shabbos Shuvah Drasha because it takes me a very long time. It takes weeks and weeks to prepare that. And as long as I have the idea and the text or a few possibilities for Rosh Hashanah that I know won't conflict with that, I sort of save that till I'm closer and I'm more in the moment, like you were talking about before. Not till the week of, but probably 3 weeks before, 2 weeks before. And then I really start to spend more time on that while still in the background working on the Shabbos Shuvah Drasha. And then Sukkot doesn't usually happen till after Yom Kippur. But
Yeah,
I have other people speak also on Sukkot. I speak one day, someone else speaks the other days. Other people do the shiurim, so I'm less pressured in that way.
yeah.
So it's
So
for me less of a marathon here than it used to be in West Hartford. Here a lot of lay people like to speak in the shul, and that's been the culture of the shul from the beginning. Plus, we have 5, 6 minyanim on Rosh Hashanah, so I actually say the same speech in multiple locations on different days, so I don't have to prepare two different Rosh Hashanah drashos. And my Yom Kippur drasha, to be honest, I actually been trying the last many years since the crowd I speak to on Yom Kippur, I never spoke to on Rosh Hashanah because I rotate all these minyanim on the 3 days. I try to keep the same message and the same story if I'm using one, so that the whole shul heard the same message, but I changed the Dvar Torah part to be more Yom Kippur related. So it's actually less intensive than it used to be, where I had one day Rosh Hashanah, another day Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur night, Yom Kippur morning, Yom Kippur Ne'ilah, plus the Shabbos. That was a lot. That was really hard. This is different.
yeah, yeah. Let me ask you, and you can pass on this question if you want. But I read about the incident, the unfortunate incident where a Sefer Torah fell in the shul. And I'm curious when it happened, how you dealt with it. If you could walk me
Yeah,
through that.
sure. I was actually away that weekday when it occurred, so I actually
I
wasn't
was on
even
a
here.
weekday.
I was on a weekday, yeah.
Mhm.
I was at a rabbinic conference. Um, Well, actually, there are two incidents that happened. I don't know which one you're referring to. One was a Shabbos. It didn't fall. It rolled off the side of the shulchan and maybe or maybe didn't hit. I was away that Shabbos, and I was also not fully aware what happened because I wasn't present for it. The weekday one I actually was there for, and now that I'm thinking about it, trying to remember the full story. I think I sent an email sort of encouraging people, telling them this happened and explaining what we were going to do and that these things happen and we'll deal with it, as opposed to feeling like it was sort of a tragic moment. To
Yeah,
convey that we're taking it seriously, but not to get too carried away.
right, right.
And
Um,
Charles Benma. Yeah.
yeah. Um, I'm trying to think of there was something that I read that I think it was maybe your Yom Kippur drasha during COVID,
Mm.
which was really amazing. You talked about the story about Admiral Byrd. Um, yeah, that was fantastic. So I'm curious where what's the process? How does it develop? You said you come up with a theme and then do you go looking for the specific supporting materials for the theme, or do you find something and say, wow, that would be a great drasha. Let's expand that because that's a great emotional or visceral story.
Yeah, all of the above is the answer. It's
Hmm.
happened in all of those ways. I think if I were to quantify, I would say um, most of the time it happens in one of two ways. Either there's something I know I need to speak about, and then I'll find a source that really resonates with that feeling, that theme, that topic. And then if I want to use a story or something, then I'll look for that afterwards. Um, Other times I don't have a specific theme I want to talk about, so I actually start with the sources and see if something really grabs me. Wow, that's interesting, that's different, that's fascinating. Then I'll start with that and say, okay, well, what can I teach based on that? What lesson can I derive from that? Usually it happens one of those two ways. Very rarely will the story drive the rest, but I'm sure it has happened on occasion.
Yeah. How much of yourself do you divulge, during your drushes? How much do you share? your own personal emotional things or situations that you're going through.
I do share. I think it is important. I try not to overdo that because I think people think that you're talking about yourself all the time when that's clearly not the intention. Um, and when it becomes too commonplace, it's not like, oh wow, they're always saying something about himself. So I try to save them, but I do. I am very open in that regard. I've talked about stories that have happened to me. I've talked about, feelings that I have surrounding a certain problem or holiday or issue, or I've expressed sometimes that I don't have the answers to things, that I'm struggling with something. Um, I've expressed sometimes how what I'm feeling differs from what I know everybody else is feeling. This happened actually after the rally in Washington. There was a lot of talk. People were very excited, the rally for Israel during the war. And I was having a very different feeling after the rally, a much less positive feeling, more depressed feeling, more pessimistic feeling, I would say. And I spoke about that in the drasha that Shabbos. And there's no right or wrong feeling, but that I was contrasting actually how I felt to how I know a lot of other people were feeling. And I got mixed reactions. Many people came up to me and said, "Thank you so much for saying that. I'm feeling the same way." And I didn't know anybody else was. And other people said, I'm so disappointed that you said that because it really like burst my bubble the way I was feeling. So you hear it both ways, but I do like to share about myself.
Yeah. And what you said that people came up to you afterwards and shared how they felt. What do you feel is the value of sharing parts of your personality with the shul? Is the value that it allows people to open themselves up to you in turn?
Certainly that's part of it. I think even without revealing stuff about myself, I think part of the goal of a rabbi giving drashas is actually so the shul gets to know you, because more than the teaching that you're doing at that time or the inspiration or the feeling that you're leaving someone, it's the main face time that you have with most members of the shul. And so they get to know you through that. And they're going to say to themselves, "Oh, I really like the way he thinks," or he's always so inspiring, or I feel really uplifted in his presence, or any of those things. And that opens doors for them to come to programs, to join shiurim that I'm giving, to come to me for advice, to open up in a pastoral setting. So it opens up a lot of avenues. They're just getting to know you based on what you say and your style and your thinking and how you approach issues, and they become comfortable with you. So sharing of yourself is just the furthering of that. And it's an enhancement of that they can really see you for who you are, which they don't often get the chance to do unless they're really speaking to you one-on-one or spending a lot of time with you. Most congregants are not going to see that. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's
Yeah.
important. That forms a connection. And yes, it does also invite them to share of themselves. So it's a two-way street.
So this is another question I usually ask people, and there's no right or wrong answer. But what are some of the maybe critical feedback you've gotten in the past in terms of your drushes?
Like many rabbis, a lot of different comments that you get over the years. Baruch Hashem, I have to say, I have very kind congregants both here and in West Hartford, and I'm sure there are people who had critical comments, but not that the drashas are so good or free of criticism, but that people either just don't say anything or they say it, but in a very kind and positive way. So I very rarely have been at the receiving end of some harsh criticism or anything like that. Not by any doing of my own, but just credit to my congregants. I think sometimes it's focused. I've gotten all kinds. Sometimes it's been focused on the words that I use, right? Whether I have poor English or poor conjugation, so that bothers somebody, or I used the word and it was in this person's mind too extreme. Why did you say that word? It's not. I don't know, just picking one. This wasn't the word, but such and such a thing was indescribable. Well, why is it indescribable? You could describe it, right? They'll argue with the usage of a word. Other times, critique comes from the perspective that I'm giving. I remember once I gave a drasha saying, a lot of people think that we focus too much on the Holocaust, and in certain settings that might be true. I actually think that in our setting, we don't focus enough on speaking about and remembering the Holocaust. I think we need to do more of that. The people felt differently. People felt like that was incorrect. We're focusing too much on the Holocaust. People have been critical, especially surrounding more emotional times or drushas. Yizkor drushas, I've actually gotten a few people's feedback that the themes or the stories that I focused on were too much about heroes, right? They're focusing on a parent that they lost at that time. And when I speak about, a brave soldier of the IDF that fell, that's great, but it doesn't speak to them when they're remembering their parent. Their parent wasn't a hero. They want to hear about more everyday, people and memory. Or people were critical of the fact that at Yizkor time, I focused a lot on, the relationship that you had with the people that you're remembering. Well, one person came up to me and says, I lost my mother when I was 3 years old. I don't remember her. She didn't have an influence on me in that way. So there are different experiences, and that sensitized me to bring in more broad messages, even if my particular story has an angle, but to broaden it so that it could speak to more people. I've learned things from all of these critical comments. Sometimes it's been about, certain phrasing felt exclusionary to people. I think if you speak too much about families or couples, then singles feel excluded. If you speak too much about male related stories or incidents, then females feel. So trying to sensitize myself to that through people's criticisms, but those are some of the ones that I've received.
Yeah. And how about on the flip side, some of the best feedback you've ever gotten, whether it comes in verbally or just an action someone took based on something you said?
Yeah, I think two stand out. I've made it a point on different occasions to speak about Taras HaMishpacha in a very public way in a drasha. Not the details of it, but the idea of it and the importance of it, and that people can feel more open to approaching whoever it is that they're going to ask questions of in that realm. And after that one time I did that, this happened every time I did that, but after one time I did that, a very meaningful conversation. A person said, I've always been too shy to ask this, and I'm asking now. And I was able to correct a major halachic flaw in what they were doing that they never even realized that they were, and they were happy, and I was happy, and it meant that my drasha really made a difference in guiding people to Torah in the right way. So that stands out as a very successful incident.
Yeah.
I think another one that I was thinking about that stands out was actually a Yizkor drasha, and the person just came up to me and said, I'm 60 something years old. I've never cried in a Yizkor drasha in my life, and I cried during yours because it really touched me, and it changed the way that I say Yizkor. It meant that I didn't just reach them intellectually, but I reached them emotionally, and I succeeded at what I wanted to do, which was really just to set the tone for the moment and to make sure that people were set up for a proper experience of davening afterwards, and that was really meaningful to me. The rest of the comments, I think, were just sort of nice comments. I really enjoyed it, or I never thought of it like that, but those were two that stood out as particularly meaningful ones to me.
Yeah, amazing. Tell me your thoughts about Chat GPT and AI and drushas, if you have any.
I haven't thought about it too much. In the beginning, people were cute about it and things, but I haven't thought about it too much. I think it's quite impressive what it's capable of doing and generating ideas. And I don't think it's like a threat in any way to the rabbis, because I think it can always help. Just like I would want to hear someone else's drasha and learn from them. So if I feed ChatGPT an idea and say, hey, can you do this as a drasha? Can you do this as a short drasha alone? And I can hear a perspective from the AI and learn from that and say, oh, I love that style. I'd like to do that. Or I don't like that at all. Actually, does mine sound like that? I want to do something different. Then why not? We can all learn from it. And at the end of the day, even if a rabbi, generated a drasha from ChatGPT and gave it like that, it comes back to what I said in the beginning. I think really the crux of a drasha is giving over of yourself to the people and connecting. And whether that's through your own words or the words of ChatGPT, I'm not saying it's ideal, but I don't know if it's totally destructive to the nature of a drasha, because really it's more about building that rapport and that relationship through whatever avenue you can. But I haven't thought about it too much, to be honest.
Yeah. I know we only have a few minutes left, but I'm curious also of your 15 years and even the years before that you were, rabbinic intern or um, how have you seen the arc of people's attention spans change and how has that affected the way you talk?
Definitely, I've seen them shortening, and people are more distracted and distractible. Hasn't really changed from the drasha standpoint, because I think I always spoke a fairly short time span, and I try to build the drasha in a way that it keeps grabbing people's attention. So I haven't sensed a real change in terms of my drasha style in that regard, but I do see it all over the place that people's attention span has changed. And maybe it's caused me to work harder at keeping people's attention and making sure the connections between the sections of my drasha are tighter, and that I'm really leading people on and grabbing people and coming back to the questions. And maybe it's caused me to tighten it up, but I think for the most part, it hasn't changed that for me.
Mm-hmm.
One
Okay.
thing I've done, over the years, and I really enjoy doing this, is, and maybe it's connected to people's attention span, but I've tried over the years to change up once every so often. At different points in my Rabban, it's been different frequencies, but maybe, every 6 weeks, every 2 months, something like that. Instead of giving a regular drush, I'll do something different during the drasha slot. So at one point in my career, I just, instead of doing a drasha, I taught about one of the sections of Sukkot Zimra. So I asked everyone to open up their siddur, and we're going to, not a drasha, but we're going to learn together this passage of Sukkot Zimra, this text of the davening. And we went through a bunch of it, probably all of Sukkot Zimra, over the course of a couple of years. Other times I did like a little mini shir about the Haftorah instead of drasha. And actually, that worked very well. Lately, what I've been doing in KMS is actually teaching one of the Zmiros of Shabbos. And I prepare a sheet, quite extensive sheet with color codings and decoding of the words and psukim on the side and sources. And I actually put it in every person's seat before Shabbos begins. So when I get up to speak, say instead of a drasha, we're going to study a Zemer the Shabbos, open up your stender, you'll find a sheet. And people found that very engaging. It sort of breaks up the monotony of a drasha all the time. People like having a sheet in front of them. It's probably longer. It's probably more like 20 minutes, but it's more of a mini shir than a drasha. But I've really enjoyed changing it up. It helps me to sort of breathe life, and it's more relaxed. It's less formal, and people like those changes.
Yeah. Yeah. I found that to be common from a lot of the rabbis that I spoke to.
Great.
Yeah. Even someone I spoke to yesterday, and I don't know why I'm blanking. I just spoke. I'm speaking to like 3 or 4 people a week. So,
Sure.
but I know Rabbi Ariel Rakovsky does it in Dallas, and whoever I spoke to yesterday that I'm blanking
Okay.
on.
Great. That's wonderful.
Okay. The last question I have for you is, if you had to give 2 pieces of advice, you're mentoring a young rabbi about to embark on a speaking career. The 2 most important pieces of advice you'd give them for speaking, either drashas or public speaking in general, teaching. What are the 2 most important things you tell them to be successful?
Wow, that's a tall order. I would probably say, and this should be a given, but it's really not, as I've heard many people speak, make sure that your idea is tight and makes sense, and that you're not drifting from thought to thought, because people will not be able to take away the idea if you've drifted too much in different directions. Make sure you have one consistent idea that you take through the drasha and that you hammer away in different fashions. That's one piece of advice. And the second, I think, is everything I've said so far, which is really to bring yourself into the drasha and use it as a means of connecting with people, because that's ultimately what I think they're looking for and what yields long-lasting results.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for doing this. Hatzlacha on all of your
Thanks for
work.
making the time. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.